Good evening, everyone. We are now in Second Kings chapter 19. When we left off in Second Kings chapter 18, we saw the interaction between Rav Shakeh, the emissary that was sent by the king of Assyria, coming from Lachish, which is a little bit away from the southwest of Jerusalem. Now, the king of Assyria has started to take over all the fortress cities, the walled cities, and has been conquering many of the cities around, and Jerusalem was the only one left. And so, by sending the emissary, Rav Shakeh, apparently a Jewish person, but I guess you can call him a possibly a Jewish person or possibly a Northern Kingdom, uh, a learned Israelite, perhaps. But he came with one intent. Unfortunately, at the end of chapter 18, he was there to mock God. And in his statements, it would be, who can withstand the king of Assyria? All the gods of all the nations that the king of Assyria has conquered, nothing has happened. The gods could not do anything. Their Elohim is of nothing. And so the mockery came to the emissaries of Hezekiah that no, don't trust in the God who you think that's going to save you. And by those statements, invoked a sense of anger in the emissaries where they tore their clothes. And now in chapter 19 and in verse 1, and then when King Hezekiah heard what was reported to him, he too tore his clothes in anger towards the mockery of God. He covered himself with sackcloth, uh, and we see these. He heard, he tore because there is a and then he covered himself with sackcloth. And the last one will be, and then entered the house of the Lord. So there are four steps, I guess you can say. And he came to the temple. Hezekiah, as you have seen, was the one who trusted in God. He had confidence in God. But as he exuded confidence in God, he saw the king of Assyria eating up his kingdom. And now he sends an emissary to tell Hezekiah his time has come. Everyone has lost. What would be different from Hezekiah and his trust in God? In verse 2, we now read, and then he sent Eliakim, his most senior trusted leader, who was in charge of his household, with Shebna the scribe and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth. And here we read, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. Now, when we read these things, we could see that within Jerusalem itself, we have Hezekiah, we have also Isaiah, and around them will eventually be the army of the Assyrians. So bear in mind the danger to Hezekiah, as also really the danger to Isaiah. In verse 3, it says, and then they said to him, that's Isaiah, this is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress They are pressed on all sides. It's a day of trouble. It's a day of rebuke. We are being corrected. It is a day of humiliation. This word here would be blasphemy. For children have come to the point of birth, and this idea, the point of birth in verse 3, uh, is that is about to be given birth to the, I guess this word here is better translated as the mouth of the womb. The child is at the mouth of the womb, about to breach. And the situation is this, and there is no strength to push the baby out. The idea is to convey an abstract situation that Hezekiah, the king of Israel, is feeling lost, is at a point where there's nothing he can do. He has used up all his strength. He is at a total loss. Verse 4. Now, verse 4 is a hope, a wish. It says, perhaps Jehovah, your God, will hear all the words of Rav Shakeh. Now, quite interesting is that you find this situation happening. We have Hezekiah in the temple, and he would be pleading with God. So he deals with God. And you would eventually find that there is always Isaiah. And Hezekiah sends people to see Isaiah. And God speaks to Isaiah, and Isaiah replies Hezekiah. Now, this is a very interesting circuit of relationship. You don't find God speaking to Hezekiah. You find God speaking to Isaiah. Why? Because Isaiah is a Navi. He is the one who can interact with God and which God communicates with, and then through Isaiah communicates with Hezekiah. But Hezekiah does present himself to God in the temple. Now, continuing in verse 4, says, perhaps the Lord your God will hear all the words of Rav Shakeh, which is a mockery of God, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God. Now, this word living God is a very important expression because Hezekiah knows that Jehovah is the living God and everyone else is not a living God. And perhaps he will avenge the words which the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, offer a prayer. Now, this is a tefillah for the remnant that is left. The supplication is what Hezekiah is asking, a supplication. And this supplication is for the remnant. This remnant is in Jerusalem. The rest of Judah has already been taken up by the king of Assyria. Now, Hezekiah told the emissaries, tell this to Isaiah. And in verse 5, and then the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. Verse 6, and then Isaiah said to them, now What does this mean? It means that in between, the servants would have spoken what was above to Isaiah, and Isaiah is replying, so that you don't have to actually read everything again. All we need to know is these words here are words by Hezekiah. So this is what you need to tell Hezekiah. This is what you shall say to your master, your Adon. It says, this is what God says. Jehovah says this: do not be fearful, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard. They are just words which the servants of the king of Assyria has blasphemed me. Now, this word blaspheme is to mock, to revile. Now, what does that mean? This means that it is to say evil about God. God hears, God knows. So do not be afraid. Why? Because God is there to defend himself. Hezekiah admits that he's at a point where there's nothing more he can do. He tried to make peace, but the king of Assyria wants everything. Verse 7. Now, what is important in verse 7 is that God has a plan. Now, always remember this is about a plan. Verse 7 says this: behold, I am going to put a spirit in him. A spirit means a wind, a form of a presence, that he will feel, he will feel something. He will notice something in him, so that he will hear news and return to his own land. Now, this is a very important expression. He will hear news, and then he will go back to Assyria. And then when he goes back to Assyria, he says, I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. Now, if you notice, these are prophetic words. The prophetic word says this: something is going to happen that the king of Assyria will notice a sense, because this one says a rock in him. It's to give this king a particular sense, a particular emotion, a particular feeling, that he will hear news that is not very good. He will hear of reports that will cause him to return, to go back to Assyria. These are very specific words of prophecy, because the king of Assyria is already in Judah. He has already conquered most of Judah with the exception of Jerusalem. Why would he go back? What would make him go back? Now, furthermore, God has said that when he is back in his own land, he will die. He will be killed. Very specific. Now, obviously, it is not as specific as who is going to kill him, when he's going to kill him, but he's not going to die a natural death. I think that is what we are saying. God is telling Hezekiah, it is not so much the prophecy that he has to watch, it is to encourage Hezekiah that this king of Assyria, powerful that he may be now, looking at what he has done so far to conquer every land he chose, and he's just next door to Jerusalem, something is going to happen, that the king is going to go home, and the king is going to return to Assyria, and the king is going to die there being killed by the sword. He is going to be murdered. He is going to be sold out by someone. Verse 8. And then Rabshakeh returned, and he returned back to Lachish. That's where he came from. Lachish. Lachish is one of the cities of the Philistines in the earlier days. And today it is also a city that is a little bit southwest of Jerusalem. And then he found the king of Assyria fighting against Livna. Now, Livna is a city that is drawing nearer to Jerusalem, for he heard that the king had left Lachish. What does this mean? It means that the king has started to move towards Jerusalem. Verse 9. And then he heard about this king, Tirhakah, the king of Cush. Now, the king of Cush is somewhere in the west of Egypt. Okay, west of Egypt. And he is coming. Behold, he has come out to fight you. And he sent messengers again to Hezekiah. Now, if you notice, what is happening is he's receiving news, he's fighting, coming to Jerusalem. The king of Assyria wants to finish off Jerusalem before he fights with Tirhakah or Tirhakeh. Uh, the reason being is this: he needs to have his army to fight against the king of Cush, and so he just needs to wrap up Jerusalem. Now, in verse 10, we are told, "This is what you shall say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, again to mock God. Do not let your Elohim, in whom you have confidence, by saying, Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Don't believe any of these things." Verse 11, "Behold, you yourself have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands that they have chosen to conquer, destroying them completely. So will you be saved?" This is a mocking as well. Mocks the king of Judah, Hezekiah. If all the other kings have fallen, what do you think will happen to Jerusalem? Verse 12, continuing on the mocking, it says, "Did the Elohim of the nations which my fathers destroyed save them?" In the ancient days, every nation have their Elohim. Every nation have an Elohim. This is I guess, the natural thing. And as Assyria came, the Assyrians conquered everyone. And the mocking says this, you know, these places of Gozan, the place of Haran, the place of Redzeph, and the sons of Eden who are in Telatsar. And then he says, where is the king of Hamath? Where is the king of Arphad? The king of the city of Sepharvaim, of Hena, of Eva. Now, these were the people who were moved to the northern kingdom, and then they started to worship their Elohim again. Now, interestingly, although the mocking is that, yeah, the Assyrians have conquered your place and your gods are proven to be weak or non existent, when they were moved to the northern kingdom, they continued to serve their gods who had lost to the Assyrians. And so the Rav Shakeh again mocked. It says, every one of these Elohim, everyone could not defend these nations here. So, what makes you think that your God can do anything? Now, in this emissary, in verse 14, and then Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers, read it, and he went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before God. And so here we find that Hezekiah put out all the letters before God. This is what the king of Assyria is saying. And Hezekiah prayed before God. He pleaded before God and said, Jehovah, the Elohim of Israel. And so in this case, you find that Israel is one of the nations. And the God here is Jehovah, not just any Elohim. And he says, enthroned above the cherubim, which is above the mercy seat. You are the Elohim. You alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. And so observe how Hezekiah prays to God. Hezekiah doesn't fall down and ask for 100 things. Hezekiah falls down and acknowledges Jehovah God. He says, you are the God of Israel, right here. You are seated above the cherubim. That's your mercy seat. You are Elohim alone over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heavens and the earth. You have done all these things. You are the only living God. It is important now for us to study the prayer that we need to understand Hezekiah knows God. Because he knows God, he knows what he has done in the past, he can have confidence in God today. He cleaned up the place and he puts all confidence in Jehovah God. He knows as the living God. And yet at this time, all the walled cities are falling to the king of Assyria. Nothing he can do about that. And so he comes before God and says this, extend your ear, incline your ear, cause your ear to hear me, Jehovah, and hear, open your eyes and see. Listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he has said to mock the living God. In the prayer, it is much pleading. It's pleading God to pull out your ear, hear what I have to say, open your eyes, see what Sennacherib has done, listen to what he has said. He has sent these letters to mock God. And the king is at a loss. What am I to do? It says here, it is true, Jehovah. The kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands. All of these, they have gone. even the northern kingdom, and have hurled their gods into the fire. Now, verse 18 says this: they have burned everything. Basically, when you say that they have hurled their Elohim into the fire, it is to demonstrate that the Assyrians are more powerful than the gods of the nations. They have thrown them into the fire and burned them, for they are not really Elohim. They have no real power, but only the works of human hands, where men produce them using wood and stone. And so they have destroyed them. So all the Elohim is nothing to the Assyrians. The Assyrians are not afraid of any Elohim at all. And so Hezekiah prays to God, pleading God. Why? Because he has placed his entire trust in God, and he's losing every part of Judah to Sennacherib. His confidence in God is worrying him, in the sense that what is God going to do? He is trusting in God, but the rest of the nations who trusted in their gods, it couldn't withstand the Assyrians. But because those gods are made of hands, the God of Hezekiah is a living God who made the heavens and the earth. And so in this prayer, it is a prayer of desperation. It is a prayer of commitment to God. It is a prayer where he is not seeing a way out. So verse 19 is the end of this prayer. He says, but now, Jehovah, our Elohim, please save us from his hand, the hand of the Assyrians, the hand of Sennacherib, so that all the kingdoms on earth may know that you alone, Jehovah, is Elohim. Jehovah is Elohim, is the only living Elohim. Hezekiah is concerned. The only place where has not fallen to the king of Assyria is Jerusalem. Isaiah is in Jerusalem, and the king of Assyria has mocked God. But as they come nearer to Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem is becoming more and more real. Verse 20, and then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent word to Hezekiah. This is what I had mentioned earlier. As you can see, the way that God interacts. We have Hezekiah here. Hezekiah prays to God, intercedes for the people, presents all the mocking messages to God. And so this is Hezekiah to God. But God doesn't speak back to Hezekiah directly. God speaks to Isaiah. And the reason why God speaks to Isaiah is because Isaiah is the Navi. Isaiah is the one who hears God and speaks on behalf of God. And Isaiah now goes and tells Hezekiah what to do. Now, the reason why I wanted to point this out to you is very simple. Hezekiah, being a righteous king, speaks to God, pleads to God, prays to God, but God doesn't speak to the king. Why? Because there is an order in the way God does things. The king is the leader of the nation, but he is not the priest. nor is he the prophet. So he is supported by the priest who deals with the sacrifices and the religious practices. And then the prophet, at least when there is a prophet, the prophet would speak on behalf of God. And so God has his order of doing things. And so God doesn't speak to the Israelites directly, God speaks to Moses. God doesn't speak to Hezekiah, God speaks to Isaiah. So it is important then for us to realize as much as the individual king prays to God, he seeks the interceding of Isaiah because the matter is pressing. Why? Because Jerusalem is about to fall to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria is expecting war with the king of Cush, and he wants to wrap up Jerusalem quickly so that he can attend to the king of Cush. Hezekiah knows that the time is coming, that he is wanting to protect the interest of God in Jerusalem. Now, we will end here today, and we will continue tomorrow for the rest of the reply of Isaiah. The reason being is that there is a lot for us to digest at this point in time, that as much as the king Hezekiah is righteous and obeys God and is doing the right thing before God, it doesn't mean that he doesn't see danger. That is one thing we have to realize. God doesn't micromanage, and Hezekiah needs to deal with Sennacherib. But as it comes to the point where Hezekiah is now at a loss, he really have to call on Isaiah and call on God because there is no one else to defend him. And the reason to talk to Isaiah is that he also realizes that God speaks to Isaiah. God doesn't speak to Hezekiah. Hezekiah knows that. So Hezekiah can only present his case, but the words that comes back from God will always come through Isaiah. And Isaiah will always refer back to the king. Thus says the Lord. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.